Hi, everybody. Welcome. I see we have people still joining. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation about managing foundation relationships. And as the presentation title indicates, these are tips that are relevant for any crisis, really, but this is a specific, COVID-19 specific presentation. Before we get started, I'll just let you know that if you have a question at any point in time, you can put it into the Zoom chat. And Nancy, who is helping with moderating information and letting people in, will let me know that there's a question. But I'll also try to make sure I look out for people's faces so that I can see people and what they're, maybe if you want to raise your hand and flag me down, I'll try to pay attention to that too. So I'm going to get started with a quick introduction. My name is Whitney Brimfield, and I'm the CEO of Spark Point Fundraising. We're a consulting firm that helps nonprofits build their revenue through both outsourced grant writing support and foundation and other types of fundraising strategy guidance. And we, of course, because of that, do a lot of work with foundations and have a pretty landscape view of the foundation world. So that's what gives me some context for this presentation. I'm going to jump right in. One second. Okay. So today we're going to chat about a few things. First, the landscape, what's currently happening, both in the foundation world and in the nonprofit world, and how are those two things connected? What can we see coming in the future, and what should we be paying attention to? And then with that information, how can we create a long-term plan for how we're going to adjust to what we're now calling the new normal? And part of that will be understanding what you need in terms of support from your funders, and then how to communicate with them about those needs that you have, and just keep them in the loop as things are continuing to shift and change. And of course, there'll be time for questions both throughout and at the end. So I look forward to this being not just me talking, but hopefully somewhat of a conversation. I know it can be tough with the Zoom structure, but we'll just jump right in. And I'll start with this. So you'll see there's like a ton of text on this slide, and it's very heavy. But basically the point of this is just to remind us all that the Great Recession happened and the world didn't fall apart. And while this situation is different, right, the Great Recession had a different cause and different impacts, and it lasted probably less time. Impact of it probably was less than this is going to be, but who knows? But the points I want you guys to take away from this are the nonprofit sector actually was one of the more resilient parts of the economy in the recession. In some, while the private sector contracted in terms of the number of people it was employing, the nonprofit sector actually grew during that period. Most organizations maintained stable funding, and some, as we're seeing now, saw increases, especially those in the human services field who are providing direct services on the ground. I think that's happening again this time around. And it was really the largest nonprofits that had the biggest impact, right? So United Ways, foundations, and donor advised funds were the ones that had the greatest loss in revenue, which of course has a big impact for this conversation as it relates to grant makers. But then also, foundation grant making decreased as a result of the recession, but it bounced back within a few years. So just keep all of this in mind. It's not exactly the same, but I'm sharing this so that you can feel a little bit hopeful, or at least not as freaked out about the future as I think we could be. And I'll give you guys a chance, if you have any questions about this, to ask at the end, because I think we could probably go down a rabbit hole with this. It's really just meant as a point of information. But what's more important is to know, what's going to happen next, right? We can't predict the future, but there's some things that I think we should be paying attention to, especially as it relates to foundation fundraising. So first and foremost, portfolio performance. So you probably know already that when foundations make decisions about how much money they're going to give away in a given year, they base those decisions on the performance of their endowment portfolio, their investment portfolio over the previous 3 years. So in 2021, there will be some impact as a result of what happens with the economy this year, but it will be balanced out a little bit by 2018 and 2019, right? But in the following year, in 2022, if our economy continues to be volatile over the course of 2021, then there could be longer lasting impacts in terms of how much money foundations are going to be giving away. So we should expect, I would say, next year for foundations to be either increasing only a small amount their budget for giving away money or maintaining the level set of funding. So that's going to create challenges for those of us who are trying to add new foundation funders to our portfolio. But there are also things that make this particular moment one of great opportunity. So foundations, a lot of them, given what's happening with COVID-19 and what is happening with the movement for Black Lives, are shifting their focus areas. So there may be now foundations that are interested in your work that weren't before. And that's something I think to really keep in mind as you move forward, that the usual suspects might not be the usual suspects anymore. I think the other thing that's really important to know is that while it's true that foundations make their decisions about how much money they're going to give away based on their portfolios, there are also workarounds. So you may have heard that there's a small group of large national foundations, including the Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation and others, who have decided to invest in social impact bonds as a way to fund additional philanthropy in the coming years. So they're actually taking on debt in a way in order to ensure that they have more money to give away. So most foundations, especially the smaller ones, are unlikely to take that step, but the fact that the large foundations are doing that, I think, is a pretty significant move, and should have a good impact on the level of foundation giving that is able to happen over the next several years. And I think that, the other thing that's really good that's come out of these crises is that people are sharing information and communicating in a much different way than they were before. I think the sense of us all being in this together has really trickled down into how we operate as organizations, and foundations are trying to support their grantees with extra content and extra information and events and gatherings that obviously are happening via Zoom, but these are opportunities to really take advantage of the time to build your foundation relationships and to network with other organizations, and that, especially in your relationships with foundations and showing up for those things that they offer and taking advantage of the supports that they're providing that are not funding, the more engaged you are with their efforts to support you, the greater your relationship is going to deepen with them over time. So it's really important to take advantage of their offerings, not to the detriment of your mission or anything like that, but certainly if they're making something available to you and it's something that is useful, you should definitely take advantage of that and acknowledge their support. Because they're trying their best to do as much as they can, knowing that money is not all that people need. And then I think finally, patience is going to be a critical factor to success over the next several years when it comes to foundations. It's going to take longer to build relationships with new funders, but you should still be doing it, right? You should still be thinking about your prospect list. You should still be thinking about how you can connect to those prospects, trying to have those meetings, especially if, for example, you've found that there are foundations that have shifted their interests now to something that you're working on. So those, I think, are the ones that are going to be primed best for potential future relationships. So really keep an eye on that and don't stop trying to build your foundation relationships as time continues to pass. I'm just going to pause there for a second if anyone has questions. And then I actually have a question for you guys. So I'll quickly pause for questions. I'm not seeing any, so I'm just going to keep moving, but Nancy will let me know if you have one. So these are some facts that I've heard from both seeing with our clients and in talking to other organizations about what's happening in the nonprofit landscape, but I'd love for you guys to share either in the chat or just speaking up. I'm not sure which way is easier. What are you seeing in your organizations and in others around you that's changed since the pandemic? And if we were in the room together, I'd pick on somebody. But because we're not, I can't. And I can only see a few of your faces. Here we go. Amanda.
Hi. I'm always happy to talk, so
great.
Ask for volunteers. I'm chatty. We talked a little bit about this yesterday in a different session, that things are okay right now. I run a nonprofit that helps victims of domestic violence, and calls are up 400%. We're in a real crisis, and the community's been responsive, foundations have been responsive, grant makers on the county and state level have been responsive. Mm-hmm. And my great fear is FY22. We just kicked off FY21 in the black and feeling like cash flow's okay, and I'm sleeping at night, and the PPP was amazing. Mm-hmm. And I just have this niggling knowledge in the back of my head that of what's next. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to start a reserve fund in honor of our 20th anniversary. And I would love your thoughts on how to sell that while I'm still raising the money I need at the same time for operations.
That may be something we should talk about offline. Okay. But I'm happy to do that. And you can get my contact information from the slides at the end. But I think that what you're asking and the things that you're seeing are helpful to others too. And I would say that the idea of creating a reserve fund is a great one. And I think you should definitely do it. And I'd be happy to chat with you about how to do that effectively. And I think you can, just for everyone's sake, to know that you can ask your foundation funders to help you with that kind of investment, as long as it's built in to some other kind of grant request. I don't think you could do that with new funders, but with current funders, especially if you have strong relationships, now is a good time to be talking to them about things like your financial sustainability. So it's not the worst thing in the world to talk with your funders about your need to build a reserve and things like that. Any other thoughts people want to share about how things have changed, what you're seeing and doing differently in the sector? I think we
Hi, I'm Carrie. What I have noticed is that, I write all the grants for our nonprofit, which we are a residential recovery residence. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I've noticed is, that, the increase in funding, just like the previous person said, literally, I've brought in grant funding alone over $142,000 since this started. And what is that going to look like next year? That's the real concern is, because a lot of these organizations have stepped up and they're doing COVID relief grants, and we're not, that's not something that's going to be there next year, or at least not in the same manner. So what I'm concentrating on is with those funders that are doing these relief grants is building that relationship for sustainability. Mm-hmm. Because the concern is, 2021, what then are we going to do if we don't continue to build relationships with these new funders that have released these COVID relief grants?
I think that's a really great point, and something we're going to talk about today. And just, these are a few of the things that we've been seeing. Many organizations, although not those that are working in direct service, right? So if you're responding to your community's needs in this time, you're probably being able to raise quite a bit more money than you would have anticipated, as Carrie and Amanda have said. But if you're working at the national level, if you're very dependent on events, if you're an advocacy organization or anything that is not an on-the-ground community-based services group, you're probably seeing some reductions in your revenue projections for 2021. And you're probably you're having some challenges with fundraising. But at the same time, everybody is dealing with this virtual work situation and social distancing. And for organizations that do direct service, that's a particular challenge because people still need to come to them or somehow interactions between people have to happen. And so working around that is a challenge that we've seen with our clients. And then of course also, and the reason why direct service organizations are so busy and raising so much money is that the need is increasing because people are out of work, they need food. I know there's an organization that we work with locally here in DC that provides food. You know, they have a food pantry as part of their services, and the need for food amongst their clients has, I think, quadrupled in the past 4 months. They're giving away tons and tons more than they used to. So I think that expense and those needs are not going to go away, at least until we have a vaccine and people are, we are able to reasonably reopen the economy. And then at the same time, because of the economy, inequities are worsening, right? So not only are health inequities a huge issue because of the pandemic, the pandemic is causing more, right? Because of the economy, because of the fact that the healthcare system is under great amounts of stress. But then also new things are coming up, like, for example, the digital divide, or people who maybe didn't need to have a computer or internet at home for their job before, now are completely cut off and so aren't able to interact with the world in the way they were before. And that access to the internet and to digital tools is a really critical thing right now. And then also economic inequities, of course, are getting worse. So all of those things are driving how foundations make decisions about where they're going to put their money. And I think it's important to keep those big picture drivers in mind as you're communicating with funders, because that's what they're thinking about, in addition to thinking about their current grantees and how they're going to make a difference in this new world. And obviously volunteers you can't use them as effectively as you probably could before because you can't be in person with them. And then finally, we're all seeing contractions in state and federal budgets because of the fact that they're having to move money around in response to the pandemic and the economic support that they're needing to provide. So that's going to cause foundations and individual donors to have to take up some of the slack that maybe before would have been filled in by government funding, which is something that happens, I think, to some extent during every economic downturn, but it's going to be much worse, I think, in the coming years than you would typically expect. So I'm sharing this because I think we all need to just be constantly paying attention to these changes and thinking about how they affect our work and our missions individually, and then communicating with our funders about those things, right? That if they want to know that you're paying attention to what's going on, of course we all are, but the only way they know that is by communicating. So it's just important to keep abreast of these shifts in how things are working. And then with all of that information, you can have a plan. I'm sure all of your organizations had come up with some kind of short-term plan for how they're going to shift in the immediate aftermath, or I guess it's still happening. So the pandemic is still happening, but in the immediate response. But you also now need to figure out what your long-term plan is going to be. People are starting to do their budgets, or maybe have already started FY21. So hopefully many of you have already thought about these things, but these are a few questions that you should think through and answer for yourselves as an organization, and then communicate what you decide on each of these points to your funders. So how has the pandemic affected your organization in any number of the ways we just reviewed in the last slide? But I think the big ones, the big buckets are finances, programs, you're doing things differently, and staff. You may have had to lay off some staff, you may have had to shift staff responsibility. So all of those things are part of how you're going to move forward. Same in terms of what you're able to do, right? Like what your impact is. Your metrics are probably changing. Maybe you're serving fewer people or more people. How are you managing the shift to virtual? How has that affected your organization's ability to have an impact? Like, for example, my company works with an organization based here in DC that does a semester in Washington internship program, which of course the great benefit of that for those who participate is that everybody comes to Washington for the summer and gets to live here and be immersed in an organization, and that's all had to go virtual. So they've had to completely change how they did everything. And I think that's likely true for lots of organizations. And how are you dealing with that? And what are you doing about the fact that maybe you've lost some staff? And how are you going to do your work in the future without those people? Or are you going to, at some point in the future, going to be able to bring them back? Those are questions, of course, I'm sure you are all working through. And then again, there are long-term structural and strategic shifts that might happen, right? I've seen a lot of organizations come to some interesting and potentially great realizations about what they can and can't do. I think a lot of organizations are seeing the value in virtual work and the opportunities that it offers you to expand your pool of potential staff people, to expand how you are able to reach your beneficiaries. So I think there are some potentially exciting and positive shifts that could happen as a result of the pandemic. And then what do you need as you're deciding what these strategic and structural shifts are going to be? What do you need to support them? And of course, money is one of the things. But there's equipment, there's software, there's technology. There maybe is a new fundraising strategy. And maybe there are new skill sets that you guys need to bring into your organization. So these are all things that you're going to need in addition to money. And you want to let your foundation funders know all of that. So my recommendation would be to take a look at these 4 questions, try to answer them as best as you can, and then use that as a kind of a shell for some kind of plan. You probably had a COVID-19 response plan that you created in the past few months. This would be kind of the next version of that with a longer term view. And those of you who have already started or completed your budgets have probably done some version of this. And I would suggest to do it if you haven't. And then if you have, really do put it down on paper in a format that would be funder facing, and share it with them, share it with your funders. I would say also you could share it with your corporate and individual donors too, if that makes sense for you. Does anybody want to share changes that they've made in the organization, shifts that they're seeing and how they're going to work, any of this stuff? And again, you can feel free to either put it in the chat, or I'm going to try to see folks. And so if you're raising your hand, I will try to see you. I don't see any hands raised or people eager to speak. So I will move on, but if you want to share something, just chat it and Nancy will call it out for me. Okay.
We just had a question from Gabrielle. She said she's asking if you can share an example of what a funder-facing plan may entail.
Yes. So this set of questions is, to me, kind of an outline for what a funder-facing plan would include. I think, in my mind, it's like a short 2-page document that tells them what's happened so far, gives them information about how you've shifted, and then tells them, well, these are the long-term changes that we're intending to make, and then of course what the resources needed are to do all of those things. It should have a number attached to it, whether that's your FY21 operating budget number, or it's some kind of differential between what you've done in the past and what you're doing now, so that they understand the gaps that you need to fill. And like I said, it doesn't have to be complex or long. It just has to be clear and have real detail in it about what you've experienced and what you're gonna do about it. So I hope that's helpful. I would say, 2 to 3 pages, a few paragraphs, or maybe a few sentences on each of these questions, depending on how complicated things are. But I don't think it has to be more than that. So I hope that's helpful for you, Gabrielle. Anything else? Yeah, I see Amanda said lack of tax base is going to reduce your grant funding next year and into the following years. And I would assume that's because you have some government funding. And that's going to be true for a lot of people. The contraction of government funding is going to be a huge challenge. I absolutely agree. Foundations are going to be expected to pick up some of that slack. So that's going to create a challenge for everyone who raises money from foundations too. Yes, everyone should vote. All right, great, we'll move on. So once you have this plan written down and you understand kind of what your needs are, you can set a budget for that, understand kind of what your revenue projections are going to be, so that you know where your gaps are. And again, might be new opportunities. I know that one of the organizations we work with has, people have become more comfortable with different ways of giving money. So I think in the direct services sector, there's always been a value, I think, among providers and nonprofits that direct cash assistance to individuals would be a great thing to be able to do at any time in a world where we have such great economic inequities, but especially right now. And funders, foundations in particular, and individuals, I think, to a certain extent, are starting to embrace that more. So there have been some pilot programs here in DC around funding direct cash assistance to people so that they can function. And that's different than what's been happening in the past, right? So there are those kinds of opportunities, but I think that there are also strategic opportunities. Given all the shifts we've all had to make in how we operate, it's bringing up all kinds of new ways that organizations might bring in revenue or even function. So think about what those might be. And definitely if you see a really big one that maybe requires a little bit of upfront investment, that's something that I think a funder would love to hear about, or even an individual major donor, certainly. One that's really interested in the organization's infrastructure and sustainability might want to invest in that kind of work. So don't count out the fact that these strategic shifts might have value and be monetized. And then, like I mentioned, any new equipment or technology costs that you have, you should map out and quantify and include in your budget. The other thing I would suggest, and I've heard a lot of organizations are doing now, is doing a shorter budget. So not 12 months, maybe 6 months, and then reassessing at that point based on what you've seen in the past 6 months. But I think in addition to having that plan, you need to have a sense of what resources, both financial and otherwise, you're going to need in order to support it.
Did you see the question from Anne about direct cash assistance?
Anne, yes. What direct cash assistance opportunities are you referring to? So I think that there are organizations that provide direct service to people living in poverty who know that what they need is money, right? Certainly the services that direct service organizations provide, like food pantries, free medical care, those displace costs, right, that people would otherwise need to cover. And that is somewhat like just handing people money, but actually just handing people money is more effective. So that's what I mean, is that nonprofit organizations are now getting funding in some small private pilot programs to just give money to people so that they can live. So that's what I mean. I don't know if there are other types of direct cash assistance that people might know about.
Can I just follow up on that? I understand what you mean by direct cash assistance, but I was wondering specifically what the program was.
Oh, here in DC, it's called Thrive DC. I believe there's a Washington Post article about it that I can share after. But it's essentially, I think, 5 nonprofits that have created a coalition, basically in partnership with DC government and with foundations. There's two programs actually. One's called DC Cares. That's a federal, or that's a DC government program. But then there's also a foundation funded program, and they've created a list of people that are partly their beneficiaries and partly identified by DC government to do this pilot program. And the details I don't have in my brain right now, but I will certainly share the Washington Post article about it.
Thank you.
Sorry, Monica, sorry, Anne, I didn't quite understand your question, so thanks for clarifying. So everybody should know what they need. Any questions about how to figure out your financial and other support needs in this period in time? Okay, I'm going to move on. Oh, wait, chat. Urban Institute. Okay.
Lisa saying, for example, Employ Prince George's has received a grant to give $200 Visa gift cards to residents who were laid off or who have lost income due to COVID. And Lane also says that we should check out the Urban Institute site. They had a webinar about Thrive yesterday.
There you go. Crowdsourcing, so effective. So once you have this all figured out, or as you're figuring it out, honestly, I think it's reasonable to have conversations with your funders about this process and these plans. They might have helpful suggestions. You should share this with your funders, of course, after you've figured it all out. If you've gotten emergency funding, surely you've probably already thanked your funders for that, but I would say thank them again. And share any updates or news coverage about how you're serving the community. Or, if you're not an organization that is a direct service organization, obviously you wouldn't be talking about how you're serving the community, but you'd be talking about your mission and impact and how that is affected and how it is progressing as a result of these shifts. And then I'd say for funders that you have a very close relationship with, or with whom you would like to have a closer relationship, and I would say also major donors, do this over the phone or in a Zoom call as opposed to just sending an email. And certainly, I'm sure I didn't need to tell any of you that. But I would say, even if there are some funders that you don't typically communicate with that directly, you might try and see if they're open to having a more direct conversation. I think funders now are, they're also uncertain, right? So I think people are more willing to share their uncertainty than they might have been in the past. And so you might have the opportunity to have a conversation with a foundation funder that normally wouldn't talk to you. We all know there are those that don't. But then now might be a time when you could maybe get in front of them, and that's always going to be helpful as long as you're well prepared for those conversations.
We have another question from Kathy.
Kathy?
Regarding direct cash assistance, is there any tax issue with giving folks more than $600, which is a contractor tax limit, in cash assistance, that they need to report it as income?
I'm so sorry, Kathy, but I do not know the answer to that question. I think that's something you might want to ask your either funder, that if you have somebody who's helping you fund something like this, or maybe your accountant. I just don't know the answer, but it's a good question. Right, and then lastly, you should be communicating more frequently with all of your funders. So if you're speaking, in the best of circumstances, you should be communicating with your funders at least once a year outside of your reports and your proposals. So if you're not doing that, definitely start doing it. But I would suggest that, especially with your largest funders and with those that are the most helpful when it comes to these kinds of issues, that quarterly would be even better, especially because things are changing so quickly. I see somebody has another question in the chat. Yeah, okay, yeah, and surely the folks could connect offline about how to conduct direct cash assistance programs. I'm guessing that it's going to be something that becomes more common, especially if it works the way I think people intend it to. But yeah, so yeah, communicating with funders, we all know, is important all the time. I think there's almost no such thing as over communicating at this point. The more they know, the more they're going to be invested in your work, and the more they're going to be confident that you're going to be successful, right? And you want them to feel that way. And then one of the things that I've seen, and I'm sure all of you have as well, is that funders are becoming a little bit more flexible. So one thing is you can ask them for non-financial support. They may have experts that you can access for free, legal, financial, HR, for example. They may be able to connect you to other organizations doing similar work, although you know, I would imagine that all of us are connecting more with partner organizations now. Or, you know, if you're looking to try something new that you've identified as an opportunity, your funder may know other organizations that are trying similar things, that it might be helpful for you to talk with them. And then, of course, extending or eliminating reporting deadlines. If there was ever a time to ask for an extension, or to just say, hey, can we wait on this report until we know more? Now would be the time. I think funders are becoming incredibly much more flexible, and let's all hope that this means that maybe they'll realize they don't need as much reporting as they thought. We can only hope. And then I'm sure some of you have seen that funders have transitioned restricted grants to unrestricted. If you have restricted grants, especially for programs that you're struggling to implement effectively as a result of the pandemic, those are great candidates for a shift to unrestricted funding. And of course, that will only help your organization. I've never seen foundations offer this as an option until now. So I would say if there's any possibility that you can do it, I would try to do it. And then, of course, because of the fact that there's so much uncertainty and so much that has changed, many projects aren't able to be implemented in the same way that we originally anticipated or planned for. And so extending your timeline for those projects as you figure out how to do them is a reasonable thing to ask from your funders. And I think generally the point of this slide is that you should ask for what you need. And I know foundations say that all the time, and sometimes we do it and we don't get what we want. But I think if you're thinking more holistically about your organization's needs and not just about your financial needs, this is a time when I think foundations can really provide a lot of those extra resources and be helpful in that way. So, you know, but don't hesitate to say, you know, hey, we really need a lawyer to help us with this specific issue. Is there one that you know, you can recommend that might work for us pro bono? You may already have a lawyer on your board that would do that for you, but not everybody does. So those are the things that you need to keep in mind and ask for. I think part of what foundations want all the time, but especially now, is for their grantees to not feel like they're alone in this work. And while it may feel that way sometimes in what was before normal, I think things are a little different now. So it's an opportunity to be a little bit more open, in my opinion.
Whitney, we have a question from Tanya. She
Okay.
says, funders have been moving more and more towards project grants. Do you think this time will help funders see the value of operating grants and investing in organizations for the long term?
I hope so. I've seen it on a micro level, certainly. And I think it's most likely to happen with those organizations that are communicating well with their funders. In terms of the shift to more unrestricted funding as a whole body in the foundation world, I think, you know, we've been having that conversation for a while. I think that there are more and more foundations that are starting to get it and understand the issues related to unrestricted funding. I think there's also a connection between the way that foundations restrict funding and control money and the conversation that we're having as a nation about racial justice, that it's important to acknowledge. So I would expect that some foundations will start to realize how their patriarchal control of money is affecting the communities they're trying to support. And so I would hope that that could be a really positive result of what's happening right now. But I would say that's going to be something that takes a while to come about. But certainly I would hope that we'd be moving away from restricted funding as much as possible. I wish I had a more like absolutely optimistic, I think it's totally going to happen answer, but I don't, I'm sorry. Any other questions about funders, funder flexibility? I see there's a chat. Okay, you're welcome, Tanya. Thanks for asking. All right, so, and you know, foundations are providing emergency funding. We have created a spreadsheet of COVID-19 response funding that we're updating regularly. There are many spreadsheets out there. This is one of them. We try to pull in as much information as we can. Community foundations have been a particularly active in this emergency funding work, and so I listed out just some of the ones we have here in the DC region, but every community foundation is providing some kind of COVID-19 response. So if you haven't had a conversation with your local foundations, that would be a good thing to do. But you please feel free, and either by sharing this slide deck, or I can just send everyone a link. I can give you a link to the spreadsheet. You can take a look. But please feel free. We created it as a resource. It's accessible to everyone. And I don't know if anyone has, I'm sure many of you have received emergency funding from foundations. Is there anything anyone wants to share about that experience, how it's gone? Has it been relatively easy? I see we have a chat question. How to build inroads with new foundations for non-COVID centric funding and whether that is worthwhile given the broader landscape. Thank you, Gabrielle, that's a great question. I think part of it comes down to your long-term plan, right? What's changed? What are you doing about it? What's going to happen from now through, you know, the end of 2021 or 2022? And those opportunities that might arise to talk to new foundations that maybe weren't paying attention to your work before. So if you identify those potential matches, that's definitely something I would jump on. I think that it's still worthwhile to try to build those relationships with new foundations. It's just going to take longer, but I definitely think you should keep doing it. It's just that, you know, it's an already long and difficult process to build new foundation relationships. It's going to get longer, but I think persistence is going to win the day. So keep trying. Yeah, and it sounds like Lynn is sharing that most emergency funding has been easy, quicker reports and quick turnaround, and that's true in my experience as well, especially for organizations like yours, Lynn, that are providing food and financial assistance. Roadblocks with new funders. Yeah, I don't know, Anne, if you want to share anything specific about those roadblocks,
Yes.
Anything that you're hearing?
Yes, I'm having a little trouble with my internet connection, so if I lose you again, I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem.
But we're a small school, and in a number of the grant applications we submitted for emergency funding, I was getting the impression that a lot of those funds were really provided to organizations that were providing a lot of direct services, like food, and while I think we had a very strong case for some of the funding we needed, you know, to address digital divide, to address new safety precautions we had to put in place, a whole range of reasons, and mostly also social emotional learning and counseling. So far, we haven't been that successful in getting new funds for those purposes. And then the other thing that we've noticed is that a number of foundations that we had hoped and had started to engage with in terms of new partners for us have more or less suggested existing grantees only. In other words, they're just going to work with their current partners aren't going to really open up their doors. So it's kind of a new closed door policy for us. And so those are things that, despite an increasing kind of demand for new kinds of funding that we need, because we are shifting and we do have new needs, we haven't been that successful in figuring out how to get those resources. So any tips would be appreciated.
One thing is, I think maybe it was about timing for you, because now there's a really big conversation happening about school and how people are going to get educated.
Yes. Yes.
So now would probably be a good time to revisit some.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But so that's one thing. But also, I think it's not surprising to hear that foundations are starting to close their doors in some cases. But I think that there are other foundations that are shifting, right? Like everything is a moving target. So, and your work is shifting too, right? There are things you're doing differently than you were before. So think about, are there things you're doing now that you weren't doing before that maybe there are different funders you could talk to? So that's one thing.
Yeah.
The other thing is, go back to them in a couple months and see where they are. I mean, I think, again, persistence is a worthwhile effort. Not that you should rest your whole strategy and all of your revenue on that, of course, but it's not, I wouldn't give up, I guess is what I'm saying. I would just keep, for the ones, I mean, we all know there are ones that are never going to come through, right? And just the ones that you feel like you're not getting traction with, I would spend less time on than you might normally. But the ones where you feel like there's something there and you just haven't had the right conversation yet, I think it's worth continuing to try, but I think it's just going to take longer, and you're going to have to wait, I think, a little longer in between your pings because things change so quickly, right? So even if it's just to say, we were talking before, I heard what you said about not taking on new grantees, but here's this new thing we've done, right? Like just to share in a stewardship kind of way, that so you're keeping those relationships fresh, even if they're not resulting in money right away. They may make a different decision after they see how the stock market has performed. Because maybe, I mean, the stock market hasn't been, it hasn't just plummeted, right? It's been up and down. So I don't know that the money that foundations have is going to change so drastically. So they may be doing that for the short term, keeping their portfolio closed, but in 3 months or 6 months, it might be a different picture. So I would keep trying.
Thank you.
We also had a comment from Lynn saying that her organization had been going through similar issues as Anna as well.
Okay, good to know. I'm sorry to hear that. But I think that's where these kind of thoughtful plans become really important, right? That we're all pivoting. So nobody should be expecting things to be as they were before. And I'm sure, Lynn, that you are not expecting things to be as they were before. But it's just a time to really be paying attention to changes, right? That everything is changing so quickly. So I would say just don't give up. Keep communicating. Any other comments? Just going to move on. Oh, well, we're in the questions and discussion part of the session. So any other things people want to share? Questions you have? I see a chat here. Yeah, that's from Lynn. Here I have my contact information here on the last slide. So I will share that. I think, so I'm at the end of my slides. I'd love to chat with you guys more if I don't know if we can unmute everyone and just talk, or I also don't know what time it is. Oh, we are probably almost out of time.
It's 11:21, so we have 9 minutes. We also have a question from Dwight. He says most large foundations or endowments use a rolling 3-year average to plan their draws to help with the ups and downs of their investments. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I mentioned that at the beginning of the presentation, that that's what they do. I think that, as Amanda pointed out, that we're not as concerned about next year because we still have 2018 and 2019 to hold us down a little. It's really 2022 that's very uncertain. And so that's, I think, what we should be looking towards is how are we going to maintain our sustainability through the next 2 years, and what Amanda is planning to do around raising a reserve fund, I think is a smart move. Obviously not the easiest money to raise, but I think if you have a thoughtful case and a plan for everything that you're going to do to shift, it can be done, especially for smaller organizations where a reserve fund might not be that large, right? Tips on how to cultivate. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was going to read the question from Gabrielle, but I think you read it.
Oh, yeah. So Gabrielle wants to know, do I have any tips on how to cultivate relationships with foundations that do not accept unsolicited proposals? Yes, I do. So when you're facing that kind of challenge, networking is your best friend. Know who at the foundation you need to connect with in order to make a pitch on your work. And then find somebody in your network who knows that person or who can connect you to that person, and then have a conversation with them. So that's not easy to do. I realize that there are a lot of steps involved in that kind of social networking, but that's how you do it. And you have to be persistent, and it may take several tries, but it's definitely worth it. And that is how people raise foundation money most of the time. So I would say even if a foundation that's a prospect of yours accepts unsolicited proposals, you should still try to build a relationship before you submit something, because you'll have a much greater chance of success. I'm sure anyone in here who's a grant writer knows this. You'd have a much greater chance of success if you have talked to somebody. Yeah, I like Amanda's suggestion, invite people to coffee with the ED. That's also a really helpful one. And the other thing is events. Like right now, obviously we're not having in-person events. But if you're doing a public-facing event, invite some of your funding prospects, even if you've never talked to them before. Those kinds of things, as long as it's an appropriate venue for them, are not a bad idea. You may get a hit. Another thing you can do is when you're having an event like that and you have a connection through another person, have that person bring that connection to an event, as Amanda's suggesting. So one way that you can create an event like that is to do a briefing on what you're doing in response to COVID. What does the next year look like for you? Those are the kinds of things right now I think that people are interested to know if they're investing in your organization. And especially if you have decided to make a significant structural or strategic shift that's taking you into a new space, that's a good time when you're sharing that vision and that new strategy with folks. That's a good time to bring in new potential funders to hear you. And I mean, again, persistence is important no matter what's happening, but right now it's really important, and everything's going to take more time. So persistence and patience. It looks like we don't have any more questions at the moment. But I would like to thank all of you for participating today and jumping in with some answers. And Amanda, I will make sure that we connect offline so we can chat about your question. And I will figure out how to make sure that everybody gets either the slides and or the link to that spreadsheet and any other information that I have that I can share with you through the conference organizers. Looks like we have a chat here. Oh, you're welcome, Lauren. I'm glad that it was helpful.
Well, thank you so much, Whitney. This was fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much, Whitney.
Thank you for helping, Nancy.
And the next session is going to be at 12 p.m. So we have a 30-minute break before Making the Ask with Matt Gayer.
Cool. That's going to be a good one.
It will be.
All right. Bye, everybody.
I know.